Welcome. I'm Matthew Phelps, co-author of the Turning to God's Word Bible study, In the Beginning, the book of Genesis. Today we'll be talking about lesson 9 of our study, which covers the book of Genesis, chapters 15 and 16. We're now in the midst of the journey and the story of Abram, and we'll stay there for some time. We've talked already about how Abram is regarded as the father of our faith and what a big deal that is, and how he is a model accordingly. And we'll talk more about that because some of the high points of that have yet to come up. In this passage, we encounter primarily a conversation between Abram and God in the form of a vision. And the really interesting thing to reflect on here is there's a lot that we can take away about prayer from this exchange and about how God acts in our lives, even sometimes outside of the direction we would think things could take, and how God's word can be binding even when things we do diverge a little bit from the original plan. The example that comes up here is God promises to Abram that he will have countless descendants. And the idea for that is that of course comes through his relationship with his wife, Sarai. They get impatient and take other measures that are not really what God had in mind, but God's promise is nonetheless binding in that case as well. And God still intervenes and carries on what he had promised to Abram, even outside of kind of the way that was in mind, although that also happens, and God writes the course as well. We also, of course, see Abram interacting with God, and we see a vision and their conversation, and there's a lot there for us to learn about how we can interact and talk with God. So we'll definitely unpack some of the details of what's happening here, although there's not a lot new. Most of what we'll focus on as we walk through the study is going to be looking at this as a means of reflecting on how we pray and talk to God. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. We get here a little more detail, maybe, about how God is talking to Abram. Definitely more detail about how he is this time. It's not God coming down as a person and having a face-to-face chat. This is happening in a vision, but it is clearly a conversation, right? Here we get, the first time it's kind of God said go, and Abram went, rather than having a conversation about it. In this instance, we're entering into a conversation between Abram and God in this vision. And it starts with God speaking. You know, if God's going to go to the trouble to talk to us, usually that's going to start with him speaking to us, which is the opposite of how I think a lot of us think about and approach prayer. Since that's how we're going to kind of unpack this, it's worth noting Abram's conversation with God begins with God talking, and not with Abram talking. Often we try to start it the other way, right? And to frame the conversation around what we want to talk about. Abram gets there, and we'll see that, but the point is kind of, as when we relate with many other people, are we prioritizing talking or listening? And I think way too often as Christians, how we're told to pray is to ask God for stuff, right? I feel like, and I've certainly been guilty of this, a lot of people's approach to prayer is they have a list of things that they're asking God for. and they go through it. And it's like, I'm going to say my prayers, and it's, well, here are the 7 things that I want to make sure I ask God for. And so it's time to pray. So I'm gonna go through my list, and I'm gonna tell God the things that I want, because He doesn't know already, right? And like that never honestly has sat that well with me, but it seemed like what a lot of people were doing. So I've definitely tried it, and it also never really sat very well with me. Where I've felt more like I was really connecting or forming any kind of relationship with God has certainly been in the times where I've been more likely to listen than to speak and ask. And then you can respond, right? But who's initiating the conversation, and what's it about, right? Think about other areas in our lives where we go to people who are more important than us. Do you try to monopolize? If you had time with the president or the Pope or even your boss, are you going to try to fill that time with everything going on with you and about you? Probably not, right? But we somehow think, well, God can be all about me. Well, maybe, but maybe that's not how you get the most from that, is making it all about you. So, long way of saying, and I know like it's maybe not something that it's taught, and it can be hard to learn to listen to God, but that is, I would suggest for anyone looking to grow in how they pray, which is really how we develop and build relationship with God, that you will get much farther if you learn to start by listening than learn to talk. We'll also see Abram model for us, there is a time and a place to then convey your concerns back to God, right? It's still a conversation. It still goes both ways. It's just, where does that conversation start, and who is framing that conversation? And that can direct a lot. So Abram has this conversation with God, as he often does when God appears to someone in the Old Testament and beyond. He starts with some variation of "don't be afraid," which really conveys the idea that if he has to say it all the time, that there is something fearsome about the way God manifests himself. Which again, fear of the Lord is an important and a positive thing, right? Again, if we had a little more fear of the Lord, maybe it wouldn't be, I want a pony, and for this and that thing. And, again, like that sense of, let's say, awe instead of fear in the presence of God and who we're trying to talk to and who we're doing, like that is a healthy and a beneficial thing. Even if God says, oh, don't worry about it, like you it's good that it's there, right? That's a good attitude to have toward God, to not be too cavalier. And then God chimes in with just some basic groundwork. I'm your shield, your reward will be very great, kind of beating the same drum. And then with an opening, we see Abram has an opportunity to voice what's been on his mind, right? We haven't really seen him respond back to God yet, other than, you got it, boss. And now it's, God, while we're talking about how this is all going to be great and my reward will be very great, about that, I'm confused. This isn't refusal or rejection or anything. It's just kind of, how does that work again? Like the thing that I really want and that we've been talking about is descendants. And you say, and you've said this is going to happen, but like, is it? Could you maybe elaborate? Because as it looks now, all of the stuff you've given me is going to one of my slaves. And that doesn't seem like what we've discussed. Would you care to elaborate a little bit? No, he doesn't say, I don't believe you. I don't think this is going to happen. I refuse or deny or reject or any of that, right? It's just, maybe you could elaborate a little bit, right? Like, that is a very fair thing. It also isn't conditional, right? People do that too, right? Like, God, I'm not sure about this. If you want me to keep doing what you tell me, then it's time that you deliver on this thing that I think we talked about, right? It's not that. He's not saying, I'm not doing any more until you give me an error. He's not denying, refusing, rejecting, right? He's still accepting, assenting, obeying. He's still doing all of those things, right? Which is how he can still be in the spirit of faith when he's doing this, right? Like, what is faith? Talked about it in other videos, but it's worth getting into it in the context of Abram, who is seen as the father of faith. And it's a badly misunderstood concept. Where we really get into problems is the English language doesn't have a verb form of the word faith, right? I can have faith, but I can't faith, right? It's not a thing that we can do as an action, which is kind of unfortunate, because then saying have faith makes it sound like some random, like, passive, like I'm just holding on to this faith that I have, right? Instead of it's a thing that I'm doing, and it's an action that I'm taking, and it's a choice that I'm making, which is what it is. It's not that it's not an action we take because there's no verb form of it. It definitely is. It's just a weird language thing. And then what comes of that is we have to find a verb that we do have and substitute it in and use it when we're taking the action of faith. And the one that we tend to use is believe, right? So when I want to have faith, or I want to act faith, right? I want to faith as an action to take, I believe. And the problem is, that's not really what that action is. And that's where a lot of misunderstanding about faith comes into play. Believing in God is not faith, right? The devil believes in God and doesn't have faith. It is a part of, to borrow a view from philosophy, belief in God is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for faith to exist, right? You can't have faith if you don't believe in God. But believing in God by itself is not sufficient. It's not enough to have faith. Failing a verb form of the word faith in English, I strongly suggest you think about using the word trust instead of the word believe. It'll go a lot farther. Neither one's entirely right, but it's a lot more right to what we're trying to do, right? When you're having faith, you are trusting. And specifically, grammar nerd, it's a transitive verb, right? You don't trust in the abstract, right? There's a thing or a person that you trust, right? I trust God. I trust the government. I trust the church. I trust my spouse, right? You don't just trust. You trust someone or something. Faith is specifically trust in God. That's the action that you are taking when you have faith, is you are placing trust in God. And then taking all of the subsequent actions that come from that trust, right? So Abram here, in expressing some doubt about what God has promised and how it's coming to be fulfilled, is not trusting God, right? The premise is still, God, okay, this is going to happen. I'm on board. But I'm not seeing it and I don't understand how, right? And that's where, when we think of faith as belief, we think of it as an exercise of our intellectual faculties. And in that regard, a lack of understanding can look like a lack of faith, right? Abram saying, I don't get it, can look like I don't believe it, can look like I don't have faith. But saying, I don't get it, but I trust you, with faith being more of an act of the spirit, the will, then you can be confused, you can not understand, and you can still continue to have faith. You can have tremendous intellectual doubt, and you can still have faith, which Abram is expressing here, right? Like, from what I'm seeing and observing with my mind, like, this doesn't seem like this is doing what we've talked about. I trust you, but I don't understand. That is a unique, and that is an important element of faith, right? St. Augustine famously wrote, I believe in order that I might understand, right? We treat it like, I have to understand this thing in order to accept it. No, no, no. And that's, so many people lose their way in the faith and religion in general, because they think that that's the order that it's supposed to go in, is I understand and then I can accept and believe and have faith. And it's the other way around, right? I make the ascent of faith and then I can come to understand and to see, which is what Abram is doing here, right? He's still faithing the whole time. He's still trusting. And from that, he's trying to build understanding of what's happening and working with God to understand. That's very much a healthy process of faith. That's a good thing to do. And we should be doing that. And he's modeling for us a thing that is fine to do, right? It's fine to question God. It's fine to sometimes wonder how things are going and why, as long as that core stays faithful, stays trusting, stays oriented toward God, and we're trying to understand and not letting trust be broken. So Abram is then having a conversation with God and is bringing up here, God, I've got a little bit of, I'm confused about how this is going. Could you clarify? So we'll see how that goes. And God responds to Abram and says, no, not the slave. You're not tracking. That's not what we mean. Glad you asked. Good, we can clarify here. To be really clear, it will be your descendant in particular, not a slave. It'll be your own son shall be your heir. Let's clear that up. That's the plan. That's what's going to happen. And from there, pick a very hard to count thing. That's how many, or an impossible to count thing. That's how many descendants you'll have from your own son. And Abram, then this is where faith comes into play, right? It's not, when will that happen exactly, God? And, under what circumstances, how, because, my wife is kind of barren, and like all these who, what, where, when, why, how, all of these things, Abram doesn't ask, right? This is where the faith kicks back in, right? He trusts. He says, oh, okay. Carry on then. Just thanks for clearing that up. We're fine then. Let's move on from here. That's where faith is modeled, right? Because how many of us would then, okay, further clarifying question, God, how, when, go through your list, right? Like, could you elaborate further? I have that answer gives me follow-up questions, but that answer also addresses the core issue, right? The core issue was, I don't get it. Is it the slave that you mean for this? Because that's what's here right now. And God said, no, not that. It's your son. And Abram said, oh, great, that's what I wanted. And then he believed or trusted the Lord, and the Lord reckoned it to him, Abram, as righteousness. That was all they had to discuss. And God saw that Abram trusted and said, man, this guy gets it. Why can't we have more of these? And probably still thinks that. This is the model of how to not only talk to God, but how to act in faith, right? Like this exchange, and obviously the big one later. I won't spoil it if any of you don't know the story, but there's, related to this promise, there is a big thing that comes about that Abram does that also demonstrates his faith. But until you get to that, this part and this line in verse 6, he believed the Lord and he credited it to him as righteousness, is brought up later as well in the Bible, as the letter to the Hebrews, among other things, talks about this, as this is the big deal. This is brought up more than the other thing that seems like it should be the main thing with Isaac. This is brought up, or in relation to, sometimes as well. But this is not a small thing, right? And it's this conversation, and it's the fact that God's word is sufficient for Abram, right? That's what trust looks like. You say it's my son. I don't see how that's going to work, but you said it, so it's going to work. So we're good. It's hard for us to do that. And it's worth noting that we're meant to. And that is the call of, it never has gone away, that faith is the means by which we have relationship with God. Jesus didn't change that. He only built on that. That is still, faith is still the means by which we begin to have any relationship with God. Right? You can't have a relationship with someone you don't trust. Certainly not a close one. Faith is essential to relationship with God. And I think so often in the world today, we keep an arm's length and a distance between us and God, specifically because we don't have this trust. And for sure, we don't act on it, right? How many times do you see people really doing things in their lives that are showing they trust God? Sometimes, it's not never, but it's not like if you're spending a lot of time around people from church, it's not that common to see either. And when you consider that it's kind of the prerequisite for Christianity, it's kind of alarming how little you see people demonstrating that they're living lives of faith. Again, exceptions abound, and it's wonderful when you see it. But for our own, personal development, from this lesson of this study, I think the big takeaway for personal growth would be to think about, do you have faith in God, and are you, right? It's not a thing you have abstractly, right? Again, it's not, the language does us no favors. It's not, I can have faith and, I can put it in my drawer next to my rosary that I don't use because I have it, right? No, you do it. Are you doing faith, right? Like all the time. Is it a part of your life and what you're doing? And if it's not, then why not? And could someone looking at how I live my life see that I am doing things that exhibit trust in God on a regular basis? Having addressed the first of Abram's concerns, then we talk about the descendants part Then we talk about the second part, the inheriting the land part. Abram is also dwelling in the land with no evidence that he was going to have any ownership of it. And God again leads the conversation, right? Abram's not bringing this up. God says, I'm the Lord who brought you from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. Notice God is inviting with these things Abram to comment, right? God's appearing to Abram, he's saying things, but he's bringing up the subjects that Abram has just accepted and been, okay, God, okay, God, okay, God. Like, God seems to realize at this point that it would do Abram good to have a conversation about these things and to work through some of this. And so he says, okay, God, how am I supposed to know? Like, you're saying, like, this particular part of my reward happens when I'm dead. So how do I know that that's going to happen? Fair question. God's answer is interesting. He doesn't say, trust me. He doesn't, so the question, instead of getting ahead of ourselves, the question is, how do I know that my descendants that I believe I'm going to have are going to inherit this land that I'm currently in? And God's answer is, bring me some animals. And then Abram brings in the animals and cuts them up and sets them down and chases away birds of prey. Oh, gee, thanks, God. Now I get it. So that's an answer to the question. I know I'm getting ahead of us and we have to get into the next question to get to this. But even this answer to the question as it's starting is a demonstration of Abram's faith, right? He asked a question and God gave him chores to do in response, which he's doing. Again, you don't get, how is a 3-year-old ram going to tell me bringing you a 3-year-old ram going to tell me how I know that I'm going to come to possess this land, right? It's not clear how these things answer that question, and Abram is still doing them. Again, how faith works, right? You might have a question for God, and the things that happen in response to that might not look like they have anything to do with that. And you might have to roll with it for a while before it makes sense. And if you're too doubting of what's going on, you might disengage and not do the things you need to do before you get to your answer. Again, understanding comes later, right? The doing comes first, and the trusting and the understanding comes later. And we really like the understanding to come first and then for the doing to happen. And that's not how God operates. The big takeaway is reorienting how we approach things with God so that the accepting and the doing come first. And then we reflect on those things and work toward the understanding. Right? Maybe the best example of that in scriptures is our Blessed Mother, right? We hear cases of weird things happening and we see she goes along with it and then she ponders them in her heart, right? She does, acts, lets things happen, accepts, and then contemplates and meditates on what those things are telling her about God and her relationship with God. And she had a great relationship with God, obviously, and still the understanding came much later in some cases than the doing or than when things were happening. And if it's good enough for her, it's good enough for every human being. So just keep that in mind because we get it backwards. I'm not abstractly any of you, me too, right? It's so easy to get that backwards. And it is so poisonous to our relationship with God when we do. The number of people in my generation I know who have lost any relationship with God because they got that backwards is astonishing. They feel absolutely convinced that they had to understand before they even tried to have any relationship with God. And you can't. It doesn't work that way. They tried an impossible thing, and when it failed, they left. And it's all because they accepted a bad premise of how this is supposed to work. And it's hard to convince people of that when they've already gone down that road. But it's so critical to internalize that the doing and the accepting have to precede the understanding and not the other way around. Now we get God's response, right? The chores were not God's response. An interesting thing occurs. As the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram, and behold, a dread and great darkness fell upon him. There are several components to that are important. And I think maybe a thing is being suggested that's not how the first reading of this can go. So the sun is going down. That suggests darkness anyway, right? And sleep, that's the thing that happens anyway when the sun goes down. So this could seem like, kind of a normal thing, right? It gets dark, Abram goes to sleep. But then you get, and behold, a dread and great darkness fell upon him. This is not ordinary darkness and sleep, right? It goes along with those things, but it is something else. There are people in the mystic tradition within the Catholic Church who describe an experience like this, where they have profound encounters with God that pull them outside of their senses, right? And darken things, and in which they have profound encounters with and experiences of God. This can be seen as a mystical experience, and Abram being absorbed into the presence of God, so to speak, which I think explains how his takeaway from this is suddenly, okay, great, right? Because all we see in the text after that is God further elaborating on, well, it's not going to come to your descendants right away. There's going to be this bit where they're in Egypt, and then they'll come back, and we've got to give it some time because the Amorites aren't that wicked yet, and it'll eventually happen. Trust me, right? Like, none of that by itself as just text really seems better than what Abram already knew that he was asking about. But in the context of it happens when a dread and great darkness had fallen upon Abram, suddenly it's very differently characterized, and it's fine, right? And it's an acceptable answer. And the difference isn't what's communicated, it's how it's communicated, right? Like the how being more important than the what, I think, in this regard. And it's, if you've ever had anything verging on any kind of mystical experience, then it doesn't leave a lot of room for doubt. I had something like this happen to me before I was even thinking about being Christian or like caring about any of that at all. And it bypassed so much along the way. Like, I never had to worry about, is there a God, right? Or like, it bypassed so many things that could have and would have gotten in the way. And probably I never would have gotten past, if we're being honest. And it wasn't the what was in the message, because I'd heard all that. Like, not a lot, but I'd heard it some, and I didn't care. But then the how the message was communicated, all of a sudden, oh yeah, I care about this. That makes sense. Okay, yep, I'm in. Sure. Right? The how the message is communicated really can, with this sort of thing, make a difference that the text really can't do it fully convey, right? But I think viewing this that way adds flavor and perspective to how this can be an answer. So it seems like a continuation of the idea of Abram's prayer life with God, and this as an encounter with God being something that, a profound one, being something that answers the question because of the person of who God is. And Abram's encounter with that, he says, oh yeah, if you say so, right? Before it was, yeah, probably, and then deeper relationship with God. Oh yeah, if you say so, sure. And then moving on, right? Like, just kind of how that thing works. But just reading it, if you're thinking Abram went to sleep and then had like a dream or something, and you think about this that way, it doesn't make much sense that he's suddenly on board just with a little bit more of an explanation. So I think there's more going on than that, and there's precedent in our tradition for this kind of thing being how God interacts with people. So it makes sense. Still, when the sun had come down and it was dark, so Abram took the animals, he cut them in half and separated the halves. That's not, by the way, how animal sacrifices worked, right? Like before or after, right? This is a unique thing that happens, to my knowledge. So we're still at a place where you've got, and Abram's been chasing off predators or scavengers. You still had these halves of these animals sitting there. And then a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch pass between the pieces in the dark. And those things are notable because they generate some light. So it's a thing that you could see. It's almost like God is passing by in the dark. Abram doesn't get to directly see God, but he gets to see the evidence of God passing due to the way that it's happening and through these cut pieces. There have been people who have commented on the Hebrew word for covenant is potentially related to the word cut, which might be true. So that could be part of what's going on here. The exact logistics of why it's animals and the passing through and what that means, I think, are not terribly clear. I certainly don't know, and I'm not sure there's a great, how that works may have been lost to time. But what is clear from the text is what this does is it marks and establishes this as a covenant. What is a covenant? Becomes an important point. A lot of people have made a lot of various covenants in the Old Testament and the significance of them. And it is significant, right? There are quite a few places where God binds himself to a certain course of action and says, from now on, this is how it's going to be. We already saw that in this book several times, but most notably with Noah and the rainbow, right? God said, oh, yep, we did that before, but now we're not going to destroy everybody with a flood again, right? That just won't happen. We'll never do that again. And God binds himself to that and promises it, and there can be some kind of sign or manifestation to show to people that has happened. But then God being God and being omnipotent, when God binds himself to things in such a way, it changes the nature of reality forever. right? Or a step even back before Noah, when things were set up to begin with, there is this core idea presented to Adam and Eve that if you sin in this particular way, then you will die. And that core idea contains within it also the promise that if you don't sin, you will not die. And that rule also governs the nature of reality, right? These covenants, these relationships, these things that God binds himself to, almost invariably involve life and death. Our life and death and how that happens. This one doesn't look like it, but it's about Abram's descendants and things that will happen to them, right? God is binding himself to this people in the future and starting them on a pathway of being his people, right? Right now, up until then, God hasn't had a relationship with a people, right? He's had relationships with individuals. And now with Abram, he's saying, I'm going to be involved with these descendants of yours that I'm promising you. He is binding himself to this people, and not just to the one guy. It's a big deal. It's a very big deal. And that's the nature of this covenant and the deal that's being struck, right? Is God is binding himself particularly to these people who don't exist yet. Kind of for the sake of and because of the actions of Abram, which is also significant, right? But when thinking about a covenant, I've heard it compared to a contract, and it kind of is, but it kind of isn't too, right? Because God's involved, it's just God binding or committing himself to a course of action that somehow fundamentally changes human reality and experience, especially as it relates to life and death. And various covenants or modifications to, it's all still extending that core rule that if you sin, you die, and if you don't sin, you don't die. Like, there really is the one covenant, like, ever. And when you get to the new covenant, it's just a way of circumventing that so that you have a different pathway to access life, even if you have sinned. But it never nullifies that one core thing exists through all of the human experience, and then these other things along the way that our covenants are interrelated to that, right? And are connected to life and death and sin and how all of that works. And ultimately, when you get to the new covenant in Christ, which is a phrase people use and nobody can articulate, it's enjoyable to ask people to articulate what the new covenant is. Because we can talk about old versus new covenants a lot, and like even asking people what is the old covenant, which is an easier question to answer, is you've been doing our Bible studies long enough. If you're watching this video, I hope you at least knew that the old one is if you sin, you die. If you didn't, you do now. The new one is, though, an addendum to that is you can sin and not die, right? And it's because the life that you live in the new covenant isn't yours. It's the life of Christ that lives in you. But that's only possible because Christ fulfilled the old covenant, but now you have a different pathway to access life. And that's the new covenant, right? And the church and relationship with Christ. And Jesus Christ changed the rules for life and death so fundamentally that it's no longer true that if you sin, you die necessarily. And he did that without nullifying that rule is still in place. He just paid the debt that was given and gives you a different life to live. And this isn't a New Testament study, and that's a very complex topic to get into in the middle of a video about Abram and a covenant. So read our New Testament studies and go along with those if you're curious about the new covenant. It's fascinating. It's a long topic. It's of course, very relevant one. But for now, covenant is something God commits himself to that changes his relationship with humanity and has some relationship also to these governing rules of life and death, and will involve life and death. And God here enters into this promise he had made to Abram. He formalizes more as a covenant, and this is reality is altered, right? You go from we're talking about how this will be true to bam, like reality is fundamentally shifted. This is done. It's irrevocable. It will be. And that irrevocable nature of it is almost immediately interesting and important in the next bit here. Here we get a statement of what will be one of the core problems for a bit. Now, Sarai, Abram's wife, bore him no children. She's barren, which under normal circumstances isn't great. Under the circumstances where Abram's been promised all of these descendants is a further complication. And she takes matters into her own hands. This is not what you're supposed to do, right? But who has the relationship with God? Abram has the relationship with God. She's trying to go along with the program, right? She's not saying, no, we're trying to veer, she's on board with she's clearly on board with the program and what God is trying to do, but she doesn't have the same relationship with God that Abram does. Again, right, you accept before you understand, and then you're trying to figure it out. And her version of trying to figure out how it can be that Abram can have all of these descendants when she's barren is that somebody else has to bear them, which is a very reasonable view. It's wrong, but it's hard to fault her for thinking that rules of biology would apply and that being barren, she would never be able to bear children. This is not a crazy thing that she decides, or it starts with a valid view at least, right? And you can see how she gets to where she gets to. But at that point, where it goes wrong is she takes this out of God's hands and into theirs, right? And that is not trust, right? Trust is, God, you've said this. You haven't instructed me that I should sleep with my wife's maid. So that's maybe not the way to do that. And maybe we should continue with the status quo until you provide very explicit instruction to the contrary if we're going to break that status quo, right? That would be the trusting thing to do here. And instead, the choice that's made is let's take matters into our own hands. If this is the thing you've said is going to happen, then you must mean that it happens this way. And so let's have Abram sleep with the maid, the wife's maid. And that is a misread of the situation, but it manifests something interesting, right? Abram has had this promise of fertility, and once he misuses that and veers from God's pathway, remember, God has entered this covenant, right, and is bound. And so now, what Abram does leads to a manifestation, in part at least, of that covenant outside of the pathway God intended, right? God has bound himself to, you're going to have all these descendants. And then Abram sleeps with Hagar, and bam, pregnant. And that leads to, we'll see, but that God is already bound to courses of action here. So things happen and there are consequences from that, which we'll get to. It's a fascinating sign of how things that God has bound himself to that then people misappropriate can yield poor consequences that God will go along with for the sake of the covenant that he has made. Areas to think about that in our world today are God has bound himself very much to his church and to actions within the church, such that in many ways he is tied up in the continuation of a human institution. And that leads to complicated things happening in church history that don't necessarily make it so God can just wipe the slate on his church, but that humans can get away with some things within it that are horrifying. But God will course correct, and like the covenant as it exists, especially the one that governs the creation and continuation of our church, is one that is able to self-correct over time, right? And he raises up saints to help with that. But it's a fascinating thing to think about. If I have promised that these things happen in these circumstances, then they will always happen in these circumstances, even if y'all create the circumstances in a bad way, like sleeping with your wife's maid instead of waiting until God intervenes with your wife. Then all of a sudden, bad consequences from a covenant God made, right? And you can, it's a thing that happens, and it's a fascinating thing to think that God can bind himself to us so much that bad things can happen that we do, and he can go along with some of that happening because of his word and his covenant. It's a fascinating thing to think about, and this is one of the preeminent Old Testament examples of that, when we get a little uppity and take things into our own hands a little bit here. And I don't mean just Sarai, by the way, right? Abram, is complicit in all of this as well, right? She brings up the idea, but he doesn't say, oh, I couldn't possibly. I think God will take care of this, right? Like, this is a case like in the garden, where you don't get to put the blame on the woman because the couple jointly does a stupid thing, right? Like, both are complicit, both are guilty, both in the fall and in this. And in both cases, the woman bringing up the idea doesn't mean she's more responsible than the man who goes along with it, right? Couples talking about and jointly deciding on a course of action leaves them both complicit and equally responsible. Another important part here. So Abram equally responsible. So Hagar, the maid, bears a son. And then she does something not ideal, which is then she starts to lord it over Sarai that, I had his son and you didn't, and starts to rub it in and make things very unpleasant and uncomfortable for Sarai, which was not the deal, right? Like, to be clear, Sarai was still the wife, right? And like the primacy of place was meant to stay there. And Hagar was acting like, well, now that I have his son, like, I should be the important one, right? And started treating Sarai that way. And then Sarai comes to Abram and says, well, is that what you meant? Like, do you mean her to be above me? Like, what do you think about all of this, Abram? And Abram says, that's not what I had in mind at all. But, this is your maid and your relationship. Figure it out. I don't care. Do what you want. What he's doing, that looks like he's bowing out. But what he's saying is, she does not have primacy of place, right? When he says you can do whatever you want, that's not a failure to make a decision on his part, right? That's saying you are the one, and I support you as my wife, and whatever you need to do about this, you have my support, right? It can be read as, him bowing out, but he's very much not bowing out of the situation. He is allowing whatever Sarai thinks is best. And what she thinks is best is to, in turn, deal harshly with her maid who was rubbing things into her to reestablish place. And probably pretty harshly, considering that Hagar's view of what she needs to do in the situation is to flee. So clearly she's having a bad time. She's not being killed, right? Like, we know, we don't know the extent. Back then, if it was a bad time, it was probably a pretty bad time, but we don't know exactly what happened. And we know she kind of had it coming, but without knowing how bad it was, we don't know how much she had it coming. We see in the next part that follows, it probably was a little excessive considering God's read of the situation and intervention. But that again is, you have all of these complications when you try to take into your own hands something that God is doing and direct it the way you want it to go, instead of sitting back and having faith and waiting for God to let things happen. An example that I think may be easier to understand here than this abstract situation about Abram and his wife and his maid, for where and how we can try to take things into our own hands, that I've seen among many of my peers as well, and have fallen into this myself. You think, I'm called to be married. You're not finding somebody who looks like the one that you're called to be married to. But here comes a girl who's willing to get involved with you, and you're kind of lonely, and it seems like she's here, and so that must be what God had in mind, right? Because she's here, and that's better than whatever else might happen. And all of a sudden, you're married, right? And it's not great, and it's not what God had in mind, right? And the whole course of your life has gone off track, and you're kind of stuck with it because now you've entered a covenant too, right? And it's kind of a mess, and it's really easy to be in alignment with God in terms of what you want and what you're trying to do, and to be out of alignment in terms of how you get there. And those details matter. Details that matters so much, right? Like the being in alignment on the general principle of I should get married is not at all helpful if you rush into the who and end up in the wrong marriage, right? Like, or I should have kids, and then you have the wrong kid with the wrong person, and then the next thing you know, there are geopolitical problems lasting for millennia, hypothetically. Not that anything like that would happen, but it's crazy how these kinds of things, right? The core concept everyone can agree to, but then the how it's executed, not, right? Another example would be life is sacred, right? And we should all be trying to live and to bring life into the world. Cool, okay, agreed. Then let's look at how we can do that in new and exciting scientific ways. And all of a sudden, the end justifies the means, and we have, that's kind of what all of these veerings away are, right? Our views of the end justifying the means, right? You agree with God on the end, and you decide you can use a means that God would not go along with, and you don't get to the same end when you don't do it the same way. oh, God, it's good for us to have children, and God would surely want us to have children. Okay. But we can't do it normally. Okay. So we have to do it this other way. Now we have ways that involve means other than your wife's maid, but that are also like not means that God approves of. Yeah, life and death, there are a lot of cases where we can take some of these matters into our own hands as well, not unlike Abram and Sarai did here. And the fear is when we don't do things the way God has in mind, as well as toward the same outcome, then you can veer so far from the course. And even if you get the intended consequence, I have a son now, I'm married. It's so hard to control for the unintended consequences when we step outside of God's plan. That those are what really get you, right? Those are where the problems lie, is things spiral out of control from those unintended consequences when you were trying best intentions. You were just trying for what you thought God wanted. But the end does not justify the means. Here we see some of those unintended consequences kick in because Hagar has a child of Abram's now. Remember, God has bound himself to relationship with Abram's descendants. So now that includes Hagar's son, and by extension a little bit Hagar. So now Hagar has an encounter with God that she wouldn't have had before, because she has a new relationship with God because of this son that she has. God is now intervening in her life because he's keeping the promise, the covenant that he has made with Abram, which he emphasizes when he says, I will so greatly multiply your descendants that they cannot be numbered for multitude. She and her son, who is not yet named, are looped in to that covenant that was made by virtue of her son being a son of Abram. He doesn't get to then selectively control for this son yes, this son no. The covenant is made and it is happening. And so now a new relationship exists between God and Hagar because of this son as well, and because of what that means. A fascinating thing happens. And it creates a new relationship with God. God, in his new forming relationship with Hagar, importantly, also has told her to go back to the situation that she left, which is a thing that's going to happen. And then here he talks to her about her son that is now involved with him. Behold, you are with child and shall bear a son, and you shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has given heed to your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against every man, and every man's hand against him, and he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen. This is the unintended consequence, right? This is God is bound so that Ishmael and his line will thrive. And still, there's something in their nature that is set against his kinsmen, the line that God has in mind for Abram. So division and conflict exist here, but even with that, because he's bound, God can't just say, nope, we're just not going to have these. We're just not going to have this branch with Ishmael, and we'll just let that branch wither and die out and not be a thing, and problem solved. God doesn't do that because he's bound by his covenant to both Ishmael and eventually Isaac. Again, fascinating that God has allowed stupid human behavior to affect what he does. That's the part of this that's fascinating, right? God, knowing better, binds himself to us in a way that we can do things, stupid things, that he will allow to happen stupidly, and will support and encourage to continue to happen stupidly. That is the relationship he wants with us, is one so complete that he will bind himself into our world and to our will in limited areas enough that that sort of thing can happen. Because surely God knows better the whole time. It's a baffling thing to think about, and it shows God's love for us, right? Like, and the truest extension of that is human will at all, right? That he allows us to choose anything, and that I can make a choice, and then like that it can affect the world at all, right? From I can move and touch a thing and it can move something, right? That is my will acting on reality. That happens because God lets that happen, right? And if I use that will to pick up a gun and to shoot somebody, at any point in time, God could make that not happen, right? Like he is enabling every second of that happening, my will to choose and to manifest and for me to act, right? God allows the things that we do for the sake of allowing us freedom of choice. And the reason that God allows us to have free will is because you cannot love if you cannot choose. God has created us to love him, and to do that we must be able to freely choose, which means he has to also allow us to choose otherwise. And because he's causing, by his thought and will, all of this to exist and to perpetuate and to continue in much more ways than just Ishmael being an ass and allowed to continue to live and to thrive. He allows all of us to do stupid things for the possibility that we might also choose to love him, which is unfathomable to think about. But that's why we exist, is to love God, and we must be able to choose to do so. And so that's the world we live in, and that's, among other things, why bad things happen to good people. But it's an interesting concept to come to terms with, is how God allows our world to work and why. Here we run into a theme that also persists for a while. Hagar is surprised that she is seeing God and is still alive. That is a thing that should be surprising. We don't know exactly how that encounter goes. Is a little interesting because it starts with the Lord found her, and then the angel of the Lord said to her. So it does seem like she was communicating through an intermediary, which matters in terms of how can she see God and live, right? Well, maybe she wasn't seeing God directly. So Hagar is demonstrating that she is taking very seriously her encounter with God, right? And is fully aware that this can be perilous or fatal. That is a thing that is understood in the ancient world, even by, she'd have been around Abram and Sarai and would have been kind of familiar with God, but obviously had no relationship with him herself yet. And nonetheless is aware of, ooh, this is maybe not an encounter I want to have. I'm lucky that I didn't die when I had it. And maybe part of the reason she doesn't is, again, that covenant that she is now a participant of by virtue of being with child. There is, I mean, that just highlights the point of the fear of God and how we approach God being important. And I think we probably have gotten too comfortable with this, right? God is present physically in every Catholic church. And we enter into the presence of God, and then we can be in the presence of God, and we can talk loudly with other people about what you're planning to have for breakfast or for lunch after Mass or something, right? Hypothetically. Nobody would do that. Nobody would stand solemnly in the presence of God and have a totally banal conversation, right? Why would you, how could, but we get too comfortable, right? We get too comfortable, and it's just another building, and it's just another place. And like Hagar was protected by the covenant that God made with Abram, we're protected by the covenant that God made with Jesus Christ. But we stand there in the presence of God, which can be very fatal, and we take it completely for granted because of the protection offered by the covenant, and we are so ignorant to what we're doing, and it's appalling, but we don't think about that, because it's just, oh, I'm in another place and Mass is over. Hopefully you at least waited that long to have the conversation, and so it's time to just be here in the sanctuary and to do outside stuff like God wasn't 30 feet away. It's a little off course, sorry, rant of mine that you all had to listen to. It's baffling to me that, like, it shows that people aren't really recognizing God's presence and taking it seriously, right? And that's like the core of our faith. And so it's kind of a little problematic when that happens. But for us, remember, in the Old Testament, people knew that coming into contact with the presence of God was a thing that you would be lucky to survive, which is why when God appeared, he said, do not be afraid. I think maybe for us these days, we should be a little more afraid. So Hagar bears her son Ishmael. We also see that Abram is 86 years old. There's some stuff about age we're not going to focus on too much, but he's not young. And that brings us to the conclusion of this lesson. Key points: covenant with God is kind of a big one, especially the implications of that. This is the fascinating example in the Bible of what can happen with that. And then relationship with God in general, and how we approach God and what it means to have faith are key points to think about and to take away. And that concludes this lesson. This has been an overview of Lesson 9 of the Turning to God's Word Bible study. In the beginning, the book of Genesis. For more information, consult our written study and visit us online at turningtogodsword.com.